At first glance, the life of a Falconeer looks fun and adventurous. You soar high above the ocean's waves, visit far-off lands, and rescue those in desperate need of help. But like any job, that initial excitement begins to wear off as the day-to-day work starts to feel more like a grind. That's how I felt as I played through the Falconeer Warrior Edition, an aerial combat game with the perfect blend of fantasy elements and Game of Thrones style politics. It has the kind of setup that would normally lead to an endless variety of action-packed missions. And yet, no matter how many wars we fight or pirates we drown, the job always seems to play out the same way. Not even soldiers riding on giant falcons can escape the monotonous drudgery of work. The Falconeer is set in a fictional world that is mostly made up of ocean and tiny islands. The Ursea, as they call it, is controlled by a number of powerful houses and countries, all of which seem to be in constant struggle for control and dominance. The Falconeers are gun-wielding soldiers who put their life on the line by riding on the backs of giant birds, all while running errands and protecting civilians from outside attackers. Yeah, it may be a tough job, but in a world as precariously balanced as this, somebody definitely needs to do it. If you've ever gotten into a dogfight with an airplane, then you're gonna feel right at home on the back of one of these massive falcons. The birds may flap their wings and dive into the ocean to eat fish, but they control remarkably similar to what you would expect from an aerial combat shooter. The big difference is the birds' agility and ability to pick up bombs and other items using their sharp talons. The rest of the combat basically boils down to the Falconeer lining up shots and taking out the enemy's own set of flying creatures, all of which is made easier with the lock-on system and secondary homing missiles. Although we're thrown into an exciting fantasy world filled with possibilities, almost all of the missions comfortably fit into only a few different categories. For example, a lot of the jobs revolve around taking a special weapon or item to an allied country, which usually involves getting ambushed by one of the other armies. There are also levels where we'll need to protect allied boats from getting ambushed from one of the other armies. And don't worry, we're not always getting ambushed, because sometimes it's our job to go into an already started battle and help our friends by defeating the other armies. Look, if all that sounds a little repetitive, it's because it is. The Falconeer's job is surprisingly predictable, because no matter what you're doing, it's guaranteed that you're gonna run into some sort of ambush or battle. A lot of the levels will start with you trying to aid a friendly boat, only to have our hero get ambushed, pick up an item, drop it off at another island cluster, get ambushed again, and then fly home, where you'll accept a reward and jump right into another identical mission. And no, that's not an exaggeration. You may not always need to deliver a useful item to a friendly neighbor, but a combination of these events will happen in every single job you take on. Now, before I get bogged down in all the other ways the developers clipped the Falconeer's wings, I first want to focus on my favorite part of the game. More than anything else, the Falconeer is great at world building. Right from the start, we're tossed into a fully realized fantasy world that feels unique and lived in. They pump us full of backstory and lore, all of which helps to make every political decision feel that much more important. And what's great about the way the game is structured is how we'll be able to see the story unfold from the perspective of all the different countries and houses. By the end of the surprisingly lengthy campaign, we'll have experienced the conflict from all sides, giving us a well-rounded experience that really does help to sell this dystopian Waterworld. Unfortunately, by spending so much time focusing on the lore and world building, the structure makes it almost impossible to care about any of the characters or their country's plight, something that ultimately left me feeling detached from the narrative. I could be fighting on the front lines of what amounts to a world war, Yet, I always felt like I was just a cog in the system. I was being told about the big picture as the action was happening around me. There was nothing keeping me invested in any of these factions, which is frustrating given how great the world building is. The repetitive missions certainly don't help. Because so many of the levels play out the same way, I found that the game's structure had a demoralizing effect. If I'm doing the same predictable missions in the same predictable ways and the only thing that's different is my allegiance, then what's even the point? The game has a way of seeming like a series of deja vu moments. The missions may get longer and the point on the map may change, but what I'm doing there remains the same. Speaking of missions getting longer, the Falconeer could definitely use some sort of checkpointing system. There are jobs where you'll go to 5 or 6 different waypoints and deal with multiple ambushes. If you die at any point in that mission, you'll end up going back to the very beginning and starting all over again. And it's actually worse than that, because there were multiple times when a mission would take me so far away from my home country that I would respawn at a completely different base, forcing me to either fly back or use the fast travel. And that brings us to the design of the open world. For as good as the world building is, I wish the world they built was more interesting. Yes, it's unique and it feels lived in, but it's also completely empty and mostly ocean. I suppose that may be realistic, and it does help to underscore the size of the world, but it's also not much fun to look at. Many of the aerial dogfights take place over the water and usually at night. There's so much water that the game will constantly recommend you using the fast travel feature. Yeah, the game is aware of how boring its world is. That's a shame, because I really do like the look of the different islands and the nations. I had a good time exploring Ursea and locating all of the landmarks on the map. The Falconeer gets a lot of the atmosphere right, especially when it comes to the lighting. It's also incredibly fun to play, especially when you're in the middle of an epic sea battle that always seems to be taking place during a lightning storm. There's a pretty great game buried deep beneath the crushing repetition. Jump on the back of your favorite bird and soar into high-flying action in the Falconeer, an aerial combat game that's easy to learn and full of nasty enemies to shoot down. Taking inspiration from Game of Thrones and Waterworld, this fantasy world comes to life with warring factions, unstable governments, and lots of sea battles that can only be resolved using a guy on a giant falcon. Unfortunately, the repetitive missions and bland open-world design ultimately keep this game grounded. Yeah, the life of a Falconeer may involve soaring through the air and shooting at bad guys, but at the end of the day, it's still a job. An incredibly repetitive job. Hey, thanks for watching our review. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new reviews and features almost every day. Now, here's the question I have for you. What is your favorite open world? I don't mean like open world game. I'm just talking about the world. Look, the game could be terrible just as long as the open world is awesome. Let me see your picks in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back on Sunday with a new episode of 10 Things We Learned This Week. And then it's back to the grind on Monday with more great content. Well, content. You can decide whether or not it's great. If that sounds good to you, then I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then,